His son's graduation, his Marine uniform. Their order, "You're a threat. Leave." As guards target the decorated black father, four silent figures rise from the crowd. They aren't just guests. They're SEALs, and they're not asking. The heavy oak doors of the prestigious Northwood Academy auditorium swung open, releasing a muted wave of anticipatory chatter and the faint, sweet scent of polished wood and floral arrangements. Master Sergeant Darnell Briggs, resplendent in his Marine Corps dress blues, paused at the threshold. The uniform, a tapestry of midnight blue and blood-red piping, fit him with the familiar comfort of a second skin. Each ribbon and medal adorning his chest, a silent testament to 3 combat tours and a career defined by unwavering dedication. Today, however, was not about his service, it was about his son, Joshua, who was not only graduating but doing so as the class valedictorian. A swell of paternal pride, fierce and profound, tightened Darnell's chest. He moved with a quiet dignity, his polished shoes clicking softly on the marble floor of the foyer. His eyes, accustomed to scanning far more hostile environments, quickly took in the scene: parents in their Sunday best, the air buzzing with excitement, ushers with polite smiles directing the flow of guests. Darnell wasn't seeking attention. Yet the uniform, a beacon of discipline and authority, drew subtle glances. Some were looks of respect, a quiet nod or a softened expression. Others were more curious, perhaps a touch surprised to see the formal military attire in this civilian setting, though it was perfectly appropriate for a proud parent on such an occasion. Darnell, a man who had navigated far more complex social terrains, registered these fleeting acknowledgments with an impassive grace. He found a seat in the orchestra section, strategically chosen for a clearer view of the stage where Joshua would soon speak. As he settled, the seat beside him was soon occupied by a distinguished man with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, retired Navy SEAL Commander Mark Olson, Joshua's adoptive father and Darnell's old friend and comrade in arms. Olson, dressed in a sharp civilian suit, offered a warm, knowing smile and a firm handshake. "He's ready. Darnell, kid's a natural." Darnell returned the smile, a rare but genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "He gets his brains from his mother, his calm from you. I just taught him how to shine his shoes." Their shared chuckle was a moment of normalcy, a brief respite before the day's main event. They had co-parented Joshua since the boy's mother, Darnell's beloved wife, had passed away when Joshua was young. Olson, a widower himself, had stepped in, becoming an integral part of their lives. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the auditorium. The principal delivered a welcoming address, followed by the procession of graduates. When Joshua's name was called, followed by the distinction valedictorian, Darnell's posture, if possible, became even straighter. His son, tall and composed in his cap and gown, ascended the stage, his gaze sweeping over the audience before briefly locking with Darnell's. In that fleeting connection, a universe of pride, love, and shared history passed between father and son. As Joshua began his speech, his voice clear and confident, Darnell allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. This was it. This was the culmination of years of sacrifice, of instilling values, of quiet support and unwavering belief. He was peripherally aware of the rustle of programs, the occasional cough, the general ambient noise of a large, captive audience. He was not, however, prepared for the distinct, unwelcome intrusion that came next. 2 men, clad in the navy blazers and gray slacks of the event's private security detail, materialized at the end of his row. They were young, their faces etched with a seriousness that seemed disproportionate to their duties. Darnell, attuned to subtle shifts in atmosphere, felt a prickle of unease. They weren't looking at the stage, but directly at him. He maintained his focus on Joshua, hoping they were merely ensuring the aisle was clear or attending to some other mundane security task. The hope was short-lived. One of the guards, a stocky man with a name tag reading Harris, leaned down, his voice a low, insistent whisper that sliced through Darnell's concentration. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Darnell turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Olson, beside him, stiffened, his amiable demeanor vanishing, replaced by the sharp alertness of a man who had commanded in the most dangerous places on earth. "Is there a problem?" "Gentlemen." Darnell's voice was calm, measured. The parade ground timbre softened but still carrying an undeniable authority. The second guard, younger and visibly more nervous. A Miller, according to his tag, avoided eye contact. Harris, however, met Darnell's gaze, his own expression a mixture of belligerence and a strange sort of self-importance. "We've had a report. Your presence is unsettling some of the other guests." "Unsettling," Darnell repeated, the word tasting foreign and absurd. He glanced around. A few nearby attendees were indeed casting curious, somewhat apprehensive glances, not at him initially, but at the sudden appearance and hushed intensity of the security guards. Their attention was now, inevitably, drawn to Darnell. Olson interjected, his voice still low but with an edge that could cut steel. "A report from whom and unsettling in what way? This man is a decorated Master Sergeant of the United States Marine Corps, here to watch his son graduate as valedictorian." Harris puffed his chest slightly. "Look, we don't want to make a scene, but this is a private event. We have the right to refuse entry or to ask anyone to leave. Your attire, it's a bit much, intimidating." Darnell felt a cold stillness settle over him. Intimidating. His uniform, the symbol of his service, his sacrifice. Now a pretext for this insult. He thought of the places he had worn this uniform, the risks he had taken, the men he had led. He thought of his son on the stage, speaking of unity and the future. Oblivious to the ugly little drama unfolding in the audience, the humiliation was a sudden, bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't the overt, spittle-flecked racism he'd encountered in his youth, or the more insidious, systemic kind he'd learned to navigate in his career. This was different, a casual, ignorant, and public denigration wrapped in the flimsy excuse of security. "This uniform," Darnell said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word precise and resonant, "is a testament to a commitment to the very freedoms that allow this gathering to take place. It is not, nor will it ever be, a threat. We're not here to debate it, sir." Miller chimed in, emboldened by Harris's stance, though his eyes still darted nervously. "We just need you to leave." Quietly. "Leave," Darnell looked towards the stage, where Joshua was hitting a poignant note in his speech, his words about overcoming challenges and building bridges ironically echoing in the charged space around his father. The idea of being ejected from his own son's moment of triumph, because his decorated uniform was deemed intimidating by ill-informed security guards, was a grotesque parody of everything he stood for. The public nature of their approach, the eyes now openly staring, the whispers starting to ripple outwards, it was a calculated or, at best, a callously indifferent act of public shaming. He felt Olson's hand briefly on his arm, a silent signal of support, but also a caution. Darnell drew a slow, deliberate breath. The room, with its chandeliers and expectant faces, seemed to recede, the voices to blur. Only the two guards, Joshua's distant voice, and a cold, rising anger remained in sharp focus. This was not just about him. It was about every black man in uniform who had ever been questioned, doubted, or disrespected. It was about his son, who deserved to have his father witness this milestone without such a stain. "No," Darnell said, his voice no longer a whisper, but a firm, unequivocal statement that carried despite its low volume. "I will not." Harris's face hardened. "Sir, don't make this difficult. We can and will escort you out." His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his belt, where a radio and perhaps other equipment were clipped. The implication was clear. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The ceremony continued on stage, a world away from the silent, Rapidly escalating confrontation in the heart of the audience, Darnell Briggs, a man of immense control and discipline, felt the carefully constructed walls around his composure begin to strain. The humiliation was profound, the injustice palpable. Darnell's refusal, "No, I will not," hung in the supercharged air between him and the two security guards. Harris's eyes narrowed, his hand now resting more purposefully on his belt. Miller, the younger guard, swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between Darnell's resolute face and Harris's aggressive posture. Commander Olson, ever the tactician, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his body angling slightly to position himself between Darnell and the more belligerent guard, Harris. His expression was a mask of cold fury, a stark contrast to his earlier warmth. "Gentlemen," Olson's voice was dangerously quiet, "you are making a severe misjudgment. I suggest you consult with your superiors before escalating a situation you clearly do not comprehend." For Darnell, the auditorium, his son's voice from the stage, even Olson's intervention, seemed to recede into a distant hum. The word intimidating, hurled at him in connection with his dress blues, had unlocked a vault of buried memories, not of combat, but of battles fought on different, yet equally challenging, terrains. The first echo resonated from over 2 decades prior, a young Lance Corporal Briggs, fresh from boot camp, brimming with the fierce pride of a newly minted Marine, walking off base in his service uniform in a small southern town. He'd been heading to a diner recommended by a senior NCO, a place supposedly welcoming to servicemen. He remembered the way the conversation had abruptly ceased when he walked in, the way every head had turned, not with admiration, but with a chilling, appraising stillness. He'd sat at the counter, the silence stretching taut, until the owner, a beefy man with eyes like chips of ice, had ambled over. "We don't serve your kind here in uniform," he'd said, not loudly, but with a finality that brooked no argument. "Makes folks uncomfortable." Uncomfortable, intimidating. The words were different, the context decades apart, but the sting was identical. Back then, he'd been alone, barely an adult, his stomach churning with a mixture of shame, anger, and a bewildering sense of injustice. He had wanted to rage, to demand his rights, to point to the eagle, globe, an anchor on a uniform, and ask what it was they found so offensive about a man sworn to defend them. But a lifetime of his mother's warnings about surviving in a world not always ready to accept him, and the stern advice of a black gunnery sergeant who told him, "Pick your battles, son. Some you fight with your fists, some with your head, and some by just outlasting the ignorance," had held him in check. He had stood, his back rigid, turned, and walked out. The silence of the diner pressing against him like a physical weight. He had endured it then, swallowed the bitterness, let it fuel his determination to excel, to become so undeniably good that his uniform could only be seen as a mark of honor. The second echo was sharper, tinged with the metallic scent of cordite and the arid dust of a foreign land. It wasn't a memory of being targeted for his race, but of what the uniform truly represented: sacrifice, brotherhood, the razor's edge between life and death. He saw Staff Sergeant Ramirez, a kid from East LA with a quick laugh and quicker hands on a rifle, bleeding out in his arms after an IED attack. Ramirez's blood soaking into the desert camouflage of Darnell's own uniform. He remembered holding Ramirez, trying to staunch the flow. The desperate words of reassurance he knew were lies. In that moment, the uniform was a shroud, a bond, a testament to shared peril. How could something forged in such crucibles of loyalty and loss ever be deemed merely intimidating in a civilian auditorium by men who likely had never faced anything more dangerous than an overzealous sports fan? This current indignity, in front of his son, at a moment that should have been pure celebration, felt like a desecration of those memories, a trivialization of the blood, sweat, and tears woven into the fabric of his service. He had remained silent in that diner years ago, a young Marine learning the harsh calculus of survival. He had endured countless slights, subtle and overt, throughout his career, choosing his moments, biding his time, focusing on his duty and the men under his command. He learned to navigate the system, to let his performance speak louder than any prejudice. He thought of Joshua. He and Olson had consciously tried to raise him in an environment that celebrated his heritage. That taught him strength and resilience without burdening him with premature cynicism. They had wanted Joshua to see Darnell's uniform and Olson's legacy as symbols of honor, not as targets for suspicion. And now this, the very thing he had tried to shield Joshua from, was unfolding. With Darnell himself at its center, a few more heads were turning in their section. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, began to circulate. "What's going on over there? Why are security talking to that soldier?" The disruption was becoming noticeable, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious proceedings on stage. Joshua, deep into his speech, seemed momentarily to falter, his eyes flicking towards the commotion in the audience, a flicker of concern crossing his face before he professionally refocused. That flicker in his son's eyes was a fresh stab for Darnell. The past wasn't just a painful memory, it was the bedrock of his present resolve. The young lance corporal who had walked out of that diner had been alone and uncertain. Master Sergeant Darnell Briggs was neither. He had endured. Yes, but endurance had its limits. Silence had been a strategy, a shield. But there were moments when silence became complicity, when enduring felt like surrender. This was rapidly becoming one of those moments. "I am Master Sergeant Darnell Briggs of the United States Marine Corps," he stated, his voice still low but now resonating with the full weight of his rank and experience. It wasn't a plea, it was a declaration. "I am here as a father, attending my son's graduation. He is the young man on that stage, the valedictorian. I suggest you check your report and reconsider your actions." Harris scoffed, a truly ugly sound. "Rank doesn't mean anything here. This is private property. We have our instructions. You either walk out or we make you walk out." He seemed to relish the confrontation, the perceived power he held. Miller, however, looked increasingly distressed, his eyes pleading with Darnell to just comply. The echoes of the past, the sacrifices of comrades, the quiet dignity of a lifetime of service, and the fierce love for his son coalesced within Darnell. The years of practiced restraint, of picking his battles, were being tested as never before. This wasn't a distant battlefield or a hostile diner in a forgotten town. This was Northwood Academy, a place of learning and aspiration, and the battlefield was his right to sit, with pride and without harassment, to witness his son's achievement. The silence he had once chosen for survival was no longer an option. The endurance was at its end. The room felt colder, the lights harsher. The scene was set, not for retreat, but for a stand. The standoff hardened, a pocket of icy immobility in the warm, expectant atmosphere of the auditorium. Joshua's voice, though still eloquent from the stage, now carried a faint strain, his peripheral awareness clearly snagged by the escalating tension around his father. Several heads in the immediate vicinity were now overtly turned, their expressions ranging from concern to confused, a few even showing a hint of annoyance at the disruption. The private security guards, Harris and Miller, seemed to feel the weight of these stares, but it manifested differently in each. Miller's discomfort was palpable. He shifted his feet, his gaze darting between Darnell, Olson, and the curious onlookers. Harris, conversely, appeared to draw perverse strength from the attention, his jawline tightening, his stance becoming more confrontational. Commander Olson, sensing the pull of appealing to the guard's basic decency, decided on a different tack. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice low and devoid of its earlier warmth, now carrying the unmistakable ring of command that had once guided SEAL teams through impossible missions. "I am Commander Mark Olson, United States Navy, retired. I am a benefactor of this academy, And more importantly, I am Master Sergeant Briggs's brother-in-arms and co-parent to that young man on stage. He gestured slightly with his chin towards Joshua. You are not dealing with an unverified individual. You are harassing a decorated Marine and a Gold Star spouse, his late wife served with distinction. The report you received is either maliciously false or grievously misinformed. I strongly advise you to radio your supervisor, explain the situation with accuracy, and await direct orders before you embarrass yourselves and this institution any further. Olson's words, delivered with chilling precision, momentarily gave Harris pause. The mention of benefactor and Gold Star spouse seemed to penetrate his aggressive bluster, if only slightly. Miller looked relieved that a potential out had been offered. Harris grumbled, benefactor or not, we have protocols. But he did reach for the radio on his shoulder, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. He spoke into it, his voice low and muffled, making it difficult for Darnell or Olson to discern the exact words, though phrases like uniformed individual, guest complaints, and refusing to cooperate drifted over. The response from the radio was a burst of static followed by a curt, unintelligible voice. Harris listened for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he clicked off the radio. Supervisor says to handle it if a guest is causing a disturbance and refuses to comply with security directives. We are to remove them. He looked back at Darnell, a renewed, almost smug, confidence in his eyes. So, like I said, you can walk or you'll be escorted. The systemic nature of the problem slammed into Darnell with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just these two guards, it was a supervisor, unseen and unheard by them, rubber stamping an eviction based on a biased, incomplete report. Protocols and directives, the faceless, bureaucratic excuses used to justify discrimination, to strip away individuality and context, leaving only a problem to be handled. He had tried to move forward, to offer them a chance to rectify their error through Olson's intervention. But the system itself seemed designed to perpetuate such injustices. The covert exploitation lay in this veneer of legitimacy, this misuse of rules to enforce prejudice. My presence is not a disturbance, Darnell stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Your actions are the disturbance. Your ignorance is the disturbance. He saw a flicker of fear in Miller's eyes, but Harris merely squared his shoulders further, around them. The murmuring increased. A woman a few rows ahead turned fully, her face a mask of disapproval aimed squarely at the guards. A man next to her muttered, "For goodness sake, he's in uniform. Let the man watch his son." But for every supportive glance, there were others who looked away, feigning sudden interest in their programs, or who watched with a detached, almost clinical curiosity, as if observing a distasteful but ultimately irrelevant spectacle. This, Darnell knew, was the complicity of silence, the passive acceptance that allowed such incidents to occur and escalate. On stage, Joshua's speech concluded. The applause was thunderous, a wave of genuine appreciation for the young valedictorian's words. But Joshua's smile, as he looked out at the audience, was strained. His eyes found Darnell's, and for a heartbreaking moment, the pride in his gaze was overshadowed by a clear, painful understanding of the confrontation unfolding below. He saw his father, not just as a proud parent, but as a target. Darnell felt a fresh surge of protective anger, mixed with a profound sadness that his son's day had been marred by this ugliness. Joshua hesitated for a split second before the principal stepped forward to shake his hand, guiding him back to his seat with the other dignitaries on stage. The ceremony was moving on, but the situation in the audience was rapidly deteriorating. "All right, that's enough talk," Harris declared, his patience, or perhaps his nerve, finally snapping. He took a decisive step forward, his hand reaching out, clearly intending to grab Darnell's arm. "You're coming with us, now." This was the precipice. Darnell had faced down armed insurgents, navigated treacherous political landscapes within the military, and endured countless instances of subtle prejudice. He had always maintained control, always chosen his response with care and precision. The years of ingrained discipline warred with the raw, visceral need to resist this baseless assault on his dignity, on his right to be present for his son. He could feel Olsen beside him, coiled like a spring, ready to act. The covert discrimination had now shed its disguise. It was morphing into overt aggression. The protocol was about to become physical. Darnell stood his ground, his body a bulwark against the encroaching injustice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threatening move, but his entire being radiated an unyielding refusal to be dismissed, to be manhandled, to be erased from his son's moment of triumph. The weight of his uniform, once a source of quiet pride, now felt like armor, not just for him, but for the principles he represented. The attempt to move forward through reason had failed. The system was unresponsive. The power dynamic, for now, still lay with the uniformed guards and their faceless supervisor. But Darnell Briggs was not a man to be easily moved, and the room was about to discover that he was not alone. The air crackled, not just with tension, but with the unspoken promise of imminent, decisive action. The moment Harris reached for him, Darnell reacted not with aggression, but with the innate, lightning-fast defensive posture of a man trained for close-quarters engagement. He didn't strike, he didn't need to. He simply shifted his weight, his arm moving almost imperceptibly, deflecting Harris's clumsy grab with an effortless parry that left the guard momentarily off balance, his hands swatting at empty air. It was a subtle movement, economical and precise, but it spoke volumes of controlled power. "Touch me," Darnell said, his voice no longer a rumble, but a flat, deadly calm that was far more menacing than any shout. "And you'll regret it." The words were not a threat, but a statement of undeniable fact. Harris, recovering his balance, flushed a deeper red. The public deflection, however minor, had clearly wounded his pride. "That's it, you're resisting Miller. Grab his other arm." Miller, who had been looking increasingly wretched, took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide with apprehension. He clearly had no stomach for a physical confrontation, especially with a man of Darnell's bearing and now with Olsen, whose steely gaze promised retribution, flanking him. But before Miller could even think about complying, before Harris could attempt another grab, a new element dramatically altered the equation. It began with a single, authoritative voice from a few rows back, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Stand down, security." Harris and Miller froze, startled. All heads in the immediate vicinity, including Darnell's and Olsen's, turned towards the source. Rising from his seat was a powerfully built man in a tailored suit that did little to conceal the formidable physique beneath. He moved with an unhurried grace, yet there was an undeniable aura of command about him. As he stepped into the aisle, his eyes, sharp and analytical, were fixed on Harris and Miller. He wasn't particularly tall, but he projected an intensity that seemed to fill the space around him. Then, from another section of the auditorium, a second man stood, taller, leaner, with the quiet watchfulness of a predator. He too began to move toward the unfolding drama, almost simultaneously. Two more figures rose from different points in the audience, one from the left, one from the far right. Each was distinct in appearance, yet they shared a commonality, a certain set of the shoulders, an economy of movement, and an expression of absolute, unflinching seriousness. They converged on the scene not with haste, but with a deliberate, synchronized purpose that was chillingly effective. The four men, seemingly ordinary members of the audience moments before, now formed a loose, almost imperceptible cordon around Darnell, Olsen, and the two hapless security guards. They didn't speak further, not immediately. They didn't need to. Their sudden, coordinated appearance and the sheer palpable force of their collective presence were enough to silence the immediate area. The whispers died. The restless shuffling ceased. Even Harris, for the first time, looked genuinely uncertain, his bravado visibly deflating. One of the four, The first who had spoken, a man with close-cropped, dark hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, addressed Harris directly, his voice calm but carrying an authority that was absolute. "We understand there's a problem here. Perhaps you can explain it to us." It wasn't a request. It was a command cloaked in civility. Harris, visibly flustered by this unexpected and formidable intervention, stammered, This is official security business. These men are interfering." The dark-haired man smiled, a brief, humorless stretching of his lips. "We wouldn't dream of interfering with official security business. We're merely concerned citizens. However, it appeared to us that you were about to physically assault this Marine." He gestured towards Darnell. He was refusing to comply," Harris sputtered, his gaze darting between the four men who now effectively penned him in. Miller looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him. "Refusing to comply with what?" "Precisely," asked another of the four, a man with a weathered face and an air of quiet intensity, "with an unlawful order to vacate the premises based on, what was it, his uniform being intimidating." Darnell and Olson exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. Olson recognized them instantly. They were former SEALs, men who had served under his command or alongside him in different capacities over the years. He hadn't known they would be here, but their presence was an unexpected, powerful reinforcement. He realized with a start that the white-haired man, his old friend, must have anticipated potential trouble, or at least wanted allies in the room. This was classic Olson, always thinking several steps ahead, always having a contingency. The first SEAL, the dark-haired one, then did something that sent a ripple of astonishment through those close enough to see. He reached into his breast pocket and casually withdrew a small, leather wallet. He flipped it open, not to show a badge, but to reveal an old, slightly worn trident insignia, the symbol of a U.S. Navy SEAL. "Commander Olson is a man we know well," he said, his voice still even. "Master Sergeant Briggs is a man we know by reputation and respect. Now, what exactly is the issue that requires 2 security guards to accost a decorated serviceman during his son's valedictory address?" As if on cue, the other 3 men also produced similar, subtle tokens of their past service: a small, challenge coin-like medallion with a unit crest, another glimpse of a trident, a quiet statement of shared identity. They didn't flaunt them, they simply let them be seen. A silent, irrefutable testimony to their background. The air in that section of the auditorium crackled. The surrounding audience members, who had been watching with a mixture of confusion and concern, were now utterly transfixed. This was no longer a simple case of overzealous security. This was something far more significant. Harris looked from the tridents to the resolute faces of the 4 men, then to Olson's stony expression, and finally to Darnell, who stood, not with triumph, but with a quiet, steely dignity. The guard's bluster had completely evaporated, replaced by a dawning awareness that he had profoundly misjudged the situation and the man. His protocol and his supervisor's detached instructions suddenly seemed very inadequate shields. We had a report," Harris mumbled, his voice barely audible, his earlier aggression gone, replaced by a defensive whine. Several guests complained he looked out of place. Out of place? The weathered SEAL raised an eyebrow. A master sergeant of the Marine Corps, in his dress blues, at his son's graduation, who, exactly, found that out of place in an institution that purports to value excellence and service. His gaze swept pointedly over the nearby rows, as if daring anyone to identify themselves as one of the complainants. No one spoke. No one met his eye. The first act of resistance had been Darnell's calm refusal and his deflection of Harris's arm. But this was a different level of intervention. The unexpected arrival of these 4 men, clearly elite former operatives, had decisively shifted the immediate power dynamic. The guards were no longer dealing with a lone individual they could bully with impunity. They were facing a united front, backed by a level of credibility and unspoken capability that was impossible to ignore. The tension hadn't broken. But it had transformed. The focus of discomfort was no longer Darnell, it was squarely on Harrison Miller, and by extension, on the institution whose protocols had allowed this farce to unfold. The room waited, breathless, to see what would happen next. The air in the Northwood Academy auditorium, already thick with the unresolved tension surrounding Darnell Briggs, grew heavier still with the irrefutable presence of the four former SEALs. Their quiet display of tridents and unit medallions was more potent than any shouted threat. It was a language understood by those who valued service and sacrifice, a clear signal that the ground had irrevocably shifted. The witnesses, initially a scattered collection of curious or concerned onlookers, were now a focused, almost breathless audience to a drama far more compelling than any graduation speech. Harris, the security guard whose belligerence had ignited this firestorm, looked cornered. His radio, his supposed line to a higher authority that had previously greenlit his aggressive actions, now seemed like a useless weight on his shoulder. He licked his lips, his eyes darting from the four imposing figures to Commander Olson, who stood with the quiet satisfaction of a general watching a perfectly executed maneuver. And then to Darnell Briggs, the epicenter of it all, who remained a figure of stoic dignity. This is still a private event, Harris managed, his voice a pale imitation of its earlier confidence. We have a job to do. These items, he gestured vaguely at the displayed insignia, don't change the fact that we had complaints. The dark-haired SEAL, who seemed to be the de facto spokesman for the group, arched an eyebrow. Complaints, he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. Let's talk about complaints. Master Sergeant Briggs, would you say your right to attend your son's graduation without harassment has been violated? Darnell's gaze met the SEAL's. I believe it has, he stated, his voice even and clear, carrying easily to the silent onlookers. Commander Olson, the SEAL continued, as a benefactor of this academy, do you have a complaint about how one of your guests, a decorated Marine and Gold Star widower, has been treated by Academy security? Olson's voice was like ice. I have a multitude of complaints, starting with gross incompetence and escalating to blatant disrespect and potential assault. Rest assured, they will be formally lodged. The SEAL nodded slowly, his eyes sweeping across the faces of Harris and Miller. Miller looked as if he was about to be physically ill. Harris, however, attempted one last, desperate grasp at authority. You can't just take over. We have rules. It was then that the four men, almost as one, seemed to draw themselves up to an even more imposing stature. The dark-haired SEAL spoke, but his voice was now joined by the other three, their words overlapping slightly, creating a powerful, resonant chorus that brooked no interruption. A practiced unison that spoke of years operating as a single, cohesive unit. We stood on walls, facing death with this man. They began, their collective voice a low, powerful rumble that seemed to shake the very floorboards. One of them, the weathered one, took a half step forward, his eyes locking onto Harris. We risked our lives, our blood, our futures, side by side with men like Master Sergeant Briggs, men whose courage is woven into the fabric of this nation's freedom. Another, the tallest of the group, continued, his voice resonating with fierce conviction. His uniform, the one you deem intimidating and out of place, is a testament to sacrifices you clearly cannot comprehend. It represents honor, not a threat. The third, who had been quieter until now, his gaze sharp and unwavering, added, we have seen him in places where protocol meant the difference between life and death, not an excuse for prejudice. His presence here is not a privilege you grant. It is his right as a father. Then the final devastating pronouncement, delivered by all four in a perfectly harmonized, unwavering crescendo, their eyes sweeping the stunned faces in the audience, then settling with burning intensity on Harris and Miller. We risked our lives alongside this man. If he doesn't deserve to sit here, then no one deserves to sit at all. The words, raw and potent, echoed through the auditorium. A thunderclap of irrefutable testimony. It was more than a defense, it was an indictment of the guards, of the unseen supervisor, of the complainants, and perhaps even of the silent witnesses who had initially done nothing. The public power dynamic didn't just flip, it shattered. Harris visibly recoiled as if struck. Miller simply hung his head, defeated. In the ensuing silence, a new sound emerged, the distinct, sharp clap of a single pair of hands, then another, and another. It started slowly, hesitantly, then swelled into a wave of applause, not the polite applause for a speaker, but a spontaneous, emotional ovation. It came from all around, from parents, from students in the balcony, even from some of the faculty who had been observing with growing alarm from the sides. It was an acclamation for Darnell, for the SEALs, and a clear repudiation of the injustice that had been unfolding. On the stage, Joshua Briggs, who had watched the entire confrontation with a maelstrom of emotions, fear, anger, pride, and finally, a dawning, fierce vindication, rose to his feet. He didn't speak, but his eyes, locked on his father, shone with an unbearable intensity. The principal, flustered and red-faced, finally seemed to grasp the enormity of the public relations disaster unfolding. He hurried to the edge of the stage, microphone in hand, clearly about to intervene. But before the principal could speak, a woman in the row directly behind where Darnell had been seated stood up. She was impeccably dressed, her face pale. "It was me," she said, her voice trembling but audible in the sudden lull as the applause began to subside. I mentioned to the usher that the uniform seemed a bit much, so formal. I didn't mean it. I never intended for this." Her eyes pleaded for understanding, but found only cold stares from those around her. The undeniable evidence wasn't just the SEAL's testimony, it was now also the confession of the flimsy, prejudiced basis for the entire incident. The dark-haired SEAL turned his gaze to her, not unkindly, but with a profound weariness. "Madam," he said, his voice softer now but still carrying, "valor and sacrifice are never a bit much. They are the bedrock of what allows us the luxury of private events." The principal finally found his voice, stammering into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, there appears to have been a most regrettable misunderstanding. Northwood Academy deeply respects our servicemen and women. Master Sergeant Briggs, please, accept our sincerest apologies. Security, stand down, stand down." His voice cracked on the last words, his gaze fixed nervously on the 4 former SEALs who still commanded the aisle. Harris and Miller, thoroughly cowed and humiliated, practically melted back, eagerness to escape the spotlight warring with the dread of future repercussions. The 4 SEALs did not move immediately. They waited, ensuring the message was unequivocally received. Then, with a final, collective nod to Darnell and Olson, they began to subtly, respectfully, move back towards their seats, the crowd parting for them as if for returning heroes. Darnell felt Olson's hand clap him firmly on the shoulder. "Well," Olson murmured, a grim smile playing on his lips, "that was more excitement than I anticipated for a graduation." Darnell looked towards his son on the stage. Joshua was still standing, no longer looking at Darnell, but at the spot where the woman had confessed, his expression thoughtful, a new understanding dawning in his young eyes. The power dynamic had indeed flipped. The witnesses had played their part, and the evidence, both of Darnell's character and the prejudice he faced, was laid bare for all to see. The public confrontation had been decisive. The room was no longer just an auditorium. It was a courtroom where justice, swift and irrefutable, had been delivered not by a gavel, but by the undeniable weight of shared sacrifice and unwavering loyalty. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a strange mixture of residual tension and dawning relief. The applause for the SEAL's dramatic intervention had subsided, but a palpable charge remained in the air. The principal, after his flustered apology, quickly tried to steer the graduation ceremony back on track. his voice overly cheerful, his demeanor betraying a deep unease. Yet, the carefully orchestrated decorum of the event had been irrevocably punctured. What had transpired in the aisles had become the true centerpiece of the day, a raw, unscheduled lesson in justice, prejudice, and the potent force of solidarity. Darnell Briggs remained standing for a moment, not in defiance, but as a man absorbing the impact of a sudden storm. Commander Olson gave his shoulder another supportive squeeze before retaking his seat. The four former SEALs, now seated again amongst the crowd, were no longer anonymous. They were figures of quiet authority, their presence a silent reminder of what had occurred. Other attendees cast them glances of respect and gratitude. The woman who had confessed to complaining about Darnell's uniform sat with her head bowed, the weight of her casual prejudice now a public burden. As the ceremony stumbled towards its conclusion, the usual platitudes about bright futures and limitless potential felt different, tinged with the stark reality of the biases that still existed, even in such privileged halls. When the graduates were finally dismissed, a significant number of parents and students made their way. Not towards the exits, but towards Darnell. They came in a steady stream, fellow parents, students who had been moved by the scene, even a few faculty members. Some offered simple handshakes and words of support. "Thank you for your service, Master Sergeant. What happened was unacceptable. Your son must be incredibly proud." Others were more visibly emotional, sharing brief stories of their own encounters with prejudice or expressing their admiration for his composure and the SEAL's intervention. It was an impromptu receiving line, a spontaneous outpouring of community affirmation. Darnell, a man more accustomed to the rigid protocols of military life than to such overt displays of public emotion, received them all with quiet grace. He shook every offered hand, listened to every comment, his earlier anger now replaced by a weary but profound sense of validation. He saw that while ignorance and prejudice were real, so too were decency and the courage to stand against injustice. Joshua reached him then, pushing through the well-wishers, his academic gown flowing behind him. He didn't speak immediately. He simply embraced his father. A fierce, heartfelt hug that conveyed everything the tumultuous events of the day had stirred in him: pride, relief, and a new, deeper understanding of the man Darnell Briggs was, beyond just being his dad. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Joshua finally murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry this happened." "Don't be sorry for this, son," Darnell said, returning the embrace. "Be aware because of it, and always stand for what's right, even when it's hard." Commander Olson joined them, along with the four SEALs who had extricated themselves from their own share of admiring onlookers. Olson introduced them formally, though names seemed secondary to the bond already forged. "Gentlemen," Darnell said, extending his hand to each in turn, "I don't have the words to express my gratitude." "You didn't have to do that." The dark-haired SEAL, whose name was Lieutenant Commander Ret. Michael Ramirez, no relation to the Staff Sergeant Darnell, had lost, but a name that still gave Darnell a momentary pause, simply smiled. "Master Sergeant, some lines don't get crossed in our presence. Family looks out for family. And today, you were family under attack." The others echoed the sentiment with firm nods. The Academy's administration, desperate to mitigate the public relations nightmare, went into overdrive. The principal, looking harried and deeply shaken, approached Darnell again, offering profuse apologies and promising a full investigation into the security team's conduct and the unfortunate initial complaints. He assured Darnell that Northwood Academy stood for inclusivity and respect, though his words now rang hollow against the backdrop of what had transpired. News of the incident spread with astonishing speed. Cell phone footage, though perhaps not capturing the entirety of the SEAL's powerful dialogue, had certainly caught the heated exchange, the arrival of the four men, and the subsequent ovation. By evening, local news outlets were picking up the story. By the next morning, the Marine, the SEALs, and the graduation was a headline beginning to ripple across national platforms. The narrative was compelling: a decorated Black Marine, a father, unjustly targeted at his valedictorian son's graduation, only to be defended by a band of elite former warriors. The security company contracted by Northwood Academy quickly issued a statement announcing the suspension of Harrison Miller, pending an investigation. The supervisor who had given the order to handle it was also placed on administrative leave. The Academy itself released a more carefully worded statement, reiterating its respect for the armed forces and promising to review its event security protocols and sensitivity training. But the true impact was felt far beyond official statements. Darnell Briggs unintentionally became a symbol. He was a symbol of dignity under pressure, of the quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of service and integrity. The Four SEALs became symbols of unwavering loyalty and the courage to intervene. The story resonated deeply because it touched upon so many raw nerves in American society: race, respect for military service, the abuse of authority, and the profound power of solidarity. Veterans groups lauded the actions of the SEALs and condemned the treatment of Darnell. Civil rights organizations highlighted the incident as a clear example of everyday prejudice, even in supposedly enlightened settings. Uncomfortable. He had never sought to be a public figure. Yet, he understood the importance of the moment. He agreed to a single, carefully considered interview with a respected national journalist, not to vilify individuals, but to speak about the broader principles at stake. He spoke of the honor of service, the importance of treating everyone with dignity, and the need for courage, not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life, to stand up to injustice. Joshua, too, found himself in a new light. His valedictory speech, already impressive, gained a new layer of meaning when viewed through the lens of what his father had endured. He became an articulate voice for a younger generation grappling with these same issues. The community reaction around Northwood Academy was one of shock, followed by introspection. The incident forced an uncomfortable but necessary conversation about unconscious bias and the responsibilities that came with privilege. The woman who had made the initial complaint faded into embarrassed obscurity, but her actions served as a stark reminder of how easily unexamined prejudice could ignite a serious injustice. Justice, in this instance, wasn't just served by the suspension of the guards, it was served by the public stripping away of pretense, by the clear demonstration that bigotry, when confronted by unified strength and moral clarity, would falter. It was served by the awakening of a community, by the conversations sparked, and by the subtle shifts in awareness that such a dramatic event could foster. Darnell Briggs never wanted to be a symbol of change, but his quiet dignity, amplified by the unexpected and powerful actions of four men he barely knew, but who recognized him as one of their own, had unfurled banners of awareness. The graduation ceremony at Northwood Academy would be remembered not just for its academic accolades, but as a day when the weight of presence, the echoes of the past, the veneer of protocol, and the unseen garrison culminated in a reckoning that resonated far beyond its ivy-covered walls, inspiring a renewed commitment to the ideals of respect and justice for all. The fight was far from over, but a significant battle had been won, not with weapons, but with courage, conviction, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood.